I knew I was in for a war the moment my helicopter was airlifted. Yes, airlifted. Off my own backyard by order of the HOA president, who then sent me an invoice and a handwritten note that said, "Maybe now you'll mow your lawn properly." The kicker? I was 800 miles away on a medical evacuation mission, literally saving someone's life, while these suburban tyrants decided my legally permitted aircraft was a threat to community tranquility. That's when I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was personal. Let me rewind just a bit. I live in a semi-rural development, large plots of land, wide open skies, and plenty of room between neighbors. I bought my property years ago specifically because it had a natural clearing in the back, ideal for a private helipad. I'm a licensed pilot, former military, and I now do freelance medevac and contract flights, so having my own takeoff space isn't a luxury, it's part of the job. The FAA was fine with it. The county was fine with it. But the local homeowners association? Not fine. Very, very not fine. At first, it started with passive-aggressive note. One showed up taped to my fence. Aircraft should not be landing in residential areas. This isn't Top Gun. Another came in the mailbox with no signature. The constant wind and noise are disruptive to nesting birds. Let me be clear. I flew maybe twice a week during daylight hours and followed every regulation to the letter. I even adjusted my approach path to avoid spooking the local deer population. But nothing I did was enough for Karen. Karen is exactly who you think she is. Mid-50s, oversized sunglasses, obsessed with rules she doesn't understand, and always armed with a clipboard and a Bluetooth headset she never actually uses. Karen is the president of our HOA, self-elected 6 years running because no one else wanted the job. She once fined a neighbor for planting non-compliant flowers that were the wrong shade of yellow. To her, my helicopter wasn't a machine, it was an act of rebellion. The confrontation escalated at a community meeting. Karen stood up, voice trembling with manufactured concern, and declared, "There is an aircraft that regularly enters and exits our skies without HOA approval. We don't know what it's carrying or if it's even safe. For all we know, it could be filming our children." The room gasped. I stood up too and calmly said, "Karen, it's me. I fly that helicopter. I'm FAA certified. And I've saved 3 people this year alone using that threat." She blinked, paused, and replied, "Well, this neighborhood wasn't zoned for ego. The funny thing is, I expected the drama. What I didn't expect was the ambush. One Friday, I was out of town flying an emergency liver transplant delivery to a regional hospital. My return trip was delayed due to weather, so I left the chopper at home, tucked neatly onto its designated helipad behind my garage. I even left a note on the door with my emergency contact. By the time I got back 3 days later, the helicopter was gone. Just gone. The concrete was scraped. The grass was damaged. And in its place was a crumpled flyer for an HOA spring beautification drive. At first, I thought it was stolen. I nearly called the FAA and the cops, until I found the invoice. It was from a private aviation recovery company 2 counties over. The invoice listed the pickup time, weight of the aircraft, hauling fee, and a note, authorized by local HOA president due to code violations. It had Karen's name on it, in actual ink. Sign. I stared at that signature for what felt like an hour. Then I laughed. It was that kind of half-sane, full-body laugh you get when you realize you've just entered a battle of wills with a petty dictator who thinks your pilot's license is a suggestion. The woman had a helicopter towed, like a car parked in the wrong spot. And she charged me for it. My first call was to the FAA, where the agent on the line nearly choked on his coffee. My second was to my aviation lawyer, who also happens to be my cousin Jason, an adrenaline junkie with a love for legal loopholes and grudges. Jason confirmed it immediately. What the HOA did was a massive overreach. Removing an aircraft from private property without owner consent or federal clearance. That's a legal landmine with propeller blades. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no. When I confronted her, politely, in front of witnesses, she denied it. We simply removed a hazard, she said with a smirk. The community voted, and safety concerns outweighed your hobby. I told her it wasn't a hobby, it was a licensed airframe. Not my concern, she snapped. This isn't an airport. And maybe now we'll all get some peace and quiet. Peace and quiet. That's when the idea started forming. You see, when people think about helicopters, they think noise, wind, chaos. But a helicopter can also be precise. Surgical. It can hover. It can carry loads. It can drop those loads. And if one were to acquire a biodegradable payload, say from a local farm, well, it could be used to fertilize certain areas. Accidentally. Over a gathering of entitled HOA members, perhaps. But that's getting ahead of myself. First, I had to get the chopper back. And second, I had to make sure everything I did from this point forward was not just legal, it was perfect. Because Karen had just declared war from the comfort of her patio chair. But I had altitude. And soon, she'd be the one buried in consequences. I didn't sleep much the night after I found out my helicopter had been towed. I kept replaying the image of that empty slab of concrete in my backyard, the faint tire marks from some industrial-grade trailer that had no business being there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's smug face and that ridiculous handwritten note. But what kept me awake the most was the realization that this wasn't just some neighborhood squabble anymore. This was a declaration of war from someone who didn't even know the first thing about the rules she broke. The next morning, I was on the phone with my cousin Jason, who, thankfully, is the exact kind of person you want in your corner when things go sideways. Jason's a real estate and aviation attorney, known in his circles for being ruthlessly polite and viciously accurate in legal matters. He listened in near silence as I walked him through everything: Karen's letters, the meeting, the invoice, the unauthorized removal. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said, "She's cooked. Give me the paperwork." I emailed him everything I had, and within the hour he'd confirmed what I suspected. Not only had Karen and the HOA violated private property laws by removing my helicopter without consent, but they may have triggered a violation under FAA Part 91, which governs the operation and handling of aircraft, even while stationary. Turns out, the FAA really doesn't like it when civilian boards decide to relocate helicopters on a whim. Especially not when it endangers public safety or bypasses aviation protocols. Jason said with a grin in his voice, "She just walked into federal territory wearing a 'Kick Me' sign." While he worked on filing a complaint with both the FAA and the county commissioner, I focused on recovering my bird. The impound lot was about 90 minutes away, operated by a company that usually dealt with repossessed crop dusters and training aircraft. When I arrived, the manager looked nervous. "We don't usually do this kind of thing," he admitted as he led me to my helicopter. "We were told it was abandoned and causing a fire risk." I asked who told him that. He pulled up the work order. It was a scanned PDF on HOA letterhead, signed by Karen. Seeing my helicopter sitting there, covered in dust and surrounded by broken lawn chairs and forgotten drones, made something snap in me. This wasn't just an insult. It was sabotage. Karen had tried to humiliate me by grounding me, by turning my professionalism, my passion, into a neighborhood punchline. She wanted the residents to see me not as a trained pilot, but as some weirdo with a toy he refused to put away. Well, if she thought she'd won, she was about to find out just how high I could fly, literally. I signed the release papers, inspected every rotor and wire, and carefully flew my helicopter back home. The moment I landed, I realized Karen had made a mistake far bigger than even she could imagine. Because by taking my chopper, she'd given me a reason to go full throttle with no guilt. She'd drawn first blood. Now it was time to retaliate with precision. That night, I found myself scrolling through Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and a few rural farming forums. What I was looking for wasn't expensive, but it had to be just right. Eventually, I found it, a second-hand manure spreader attachment designed for agricultural drones. It was basically a big bucket with a remote dump feature, designed to be mounted on small helicopters or heavy-duty drones for spreading compost. With a few tweaks, I could modify it to fit my rig. It was advertised as lightly used, still smells fresh. Perfect. The farmer who sold it to me was a wiry old man named Gus, who didn't ask many questions, but gave me a look when I explained the kind of fertilizing I had in mind. "You ain't droppin' this on no crops, are ya?" he asked, grinning through crooked teeth. "Let's just say it's for a special delivery," I said. He slapped his knee and said, "Well damn, let me throw in an extra scoop." By the end of the week, I had everything I needed: manure, bucket, release rig, and a flight plan. I wasn't just going to get even. I was going to turn Karen's perfect little HOA meeting into a full-blown disaster movie. And as luck would have it, the timing was perfect. I'd heard through the grapevine that the HOA was planning its quarterly open-air meeting the following Saturday. It was supposed to be a community celebration, complete with folding chairs, banners, and a catered lunch. Karen, of course, would be giving a speech about maintaining order in an unstable world. Well, I figured I'd help demonstrate instability. But then something happened I didn't expect. I was at the grocery store picking up supplies when I bumped into my neighbor Derek, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. He leaned in and whispered, "You hear they invited Senator Blevins to that meeting?" I blinked. "The state senator?" "Yup," he said. "Karen wants him to see how model our neighborhood is. Thinks it'll help her get on some zoning board or something." That threw a wrench in the plan. I didn't mind embarrassing Karen. I didn't even mind spooking the HOA. But dropping manure within 20 feet of an elected official? That could backfire in a dozen different ways. The last thing I needed was to be on the news for turning a political meet and greet into a poop storm. I considered canceling the entire operation, but then I had a better idea, one that was smarter, funnier, and even more targeted. That night, I pulled out a bunch of old Amazon boxes and paint. Over the next few hours, I built a crude but recognizable cardboard cutout of Karen, oversized sunglasses, clipboard, arms folded in permanent judgment. I staked it into the ground, just off to the side of the HOA's main meeting area. Then I measured the distance from above with a test flight, locking in the GPS coordinates and adjusting for wind. This time, there'd be no misfires. My payload wouldn't hit the actual guest. But the message? That was going to land squarely in everyone's lap. I spent the next 2 days fine-tuning the bucket and rehearsing the drop. I practiced hovering, marked timing cues, even added a failsafe that would abort the release if I dipped below a certain altitude. I wasn't just covering my bases, I was building an alibi. Saturday arrived bright and early. The sky was clear. The temperature was perfect. The HOA's banners flapped cheerily in the breeze, and Karen had even set up a microphone stand at the edge of the park lawn. I watched from a distance, sipping coffee from a thermos and smiling as folding chairs filled with residents, guests, and a few unlucky reporters. They had no idea what was coming. Not even Karen. Because when the time was right, and that cardboard version of her stood tall like a paper idol to pettiness, I was going to descend like justice on rotor blades, with a gift from the sky she'd never forget. The plan was simple in theory, but I wasn't leaving anything to chance. Karen had crossed a line when she had my helicopter towed, and now that she was parading around with state officials and using her HOA kingdom as a stepping stone to some local political gig, it was time she got a reality check, preferably one that landed with the subtlety of a cow dropping from 500 feet. Still, I knew the difference between petty and precision. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making a point so loud, so unforgettable, that not even her clipboard could erase it. The first task was securing the payload. Gus, the farmer who sold me the manure bucket, was more than happy to help with the next phase of the operation. "You want fresh or aged?" he asked, leaning over the side of a rusty wheelbarrow that was steaming slightly. Aged, I said. We want the full effect without creating a biohazard. He laughed like it was the best request he'd heard all week, then added, You want some straw in there? Gives it structure on the drop. This man was a manure artist, and I trusted his instincts. Within an hour, we had a hefty, well-balanced load of matured farm waste, perfect in weight and consistency. To the untrained nose, it smelled like fertilizer. To anyone within a 10-foot radius, it was an assault on dignity. Back home, I spent the evening fine-tuning the mechanic. The bucket rig was secured with redundant locking straps, the release system wired to my control console inside the cockpit. I tested it 3 times with sandbags, each drop hitting the test zone within a foot of the marker. I added a camera to record everything from both above and below. This wasn't just a mission, it was documentation. I even wrote a short disclaimer on the bucket itself, 100% biodegradable. Courtesy of nature. Just in case anyone decided to frame it as environmental terrorism. The next morning, I did a full walk-around of the helicopter. Everything was in working order. Fuel topped off. Rotors balanced. Flight plan filed as a routine community flyover with visual inspection for agricultural mapping. It was vague enough to sound boring but real enough to be approved. That's the beauty of FAA paperwork. It's not what you're doing, it's how you word it. By noon, the HOA meeting was in full swing. Folding chairs were lined up in neat rows across the park lawn. A banner hung over the gazebo that read, Quarterly Unity Meeting, Building a Better Tomorrow. Karen stood at the podium, basking in applause as if she were announcing the cure for aging. The cardboard decoy I had planted the night before stood just off to the side of the gathering, an exaggerated version of her posture and expression, complete with a cartoonish clipboard that read Citation Machine. Hovering above them from a few hundred feet up, I could hear muffled microphone feedback and the start of her speech. I kept my altitude legal, safe, and stable. The winds were calm. The GPS was locked. My hands hovered over the release switch. Just before I pushed it, I said into the cockpit recorder, For every HOA president who forgot they serve the people, not rule them. I clicked the switch. The bucket swung open with a soft mechanical whine, and the manure rained down in a glorious arc directly onto the cardboard cairn. The force flattened the structure in a single, smelly explosion. A puff of dried straw and dark compost burst outward like confetti from the world's worst party cannon. From above, it looked almost artistic. On the ground, it triggered absolute chaos. People screamed. A few chairs toppled. Karen shrieked loud enough that I could hear it through my noise-canceling headset. The senator jumped to his feet, shielding himself with a folder as if he were under siege. The crowd scattered in every direction, covering their noses and pointing at the smoldering wreckage of their papery mascot. Some thought it was a prank. Others weren't sure if it was an attack. One kid yelled, "The birds got revenge." I hovered for another 10 seconds, then slowly turned the helicopter back toward home. As I flew away, I caught a glimpse of Karen pointing furiously at the sky while flailing like someone trying to swat God. I kept my speed slow and steady, giving them a good, long look at the tail number, just legal enough to avoid accusations of fleeing, just smug enough to ensure they remembered who owned the sky. When I landed, I didn't even take off my headset before the phone rang. It was Jason. "You just went viral," he said without preamble. Some kid posted the drop from the bleachers. 15,000 views in 20 minutes. They've already added dramatic music and called it the poopening. I groaned and laughed at the same time. "How bad is it?" He paused, then said, "Legally? You're fine. Didn't touch anyone, didn't hit public property, stayed in FAA bounds. Morally? You're a folk hero." But things weren't all high fives and manure confetti. By that evening, Karen had filed a formal complaint with the local police. They came by the house, not in riot gear or anything, just a couple of tired-looking officers who'd clearly drawn the short straw. One of them looked around my backyard and said, "Is this the launch site?" I nodded. Yes, sir. Fully legal. He sighed, then looked at his partner. We're really doing this? The other guy shrugged. Karen's blowing up the dispatch phone. I invited them in, showed them the flight plan, the footage, the GPS logs, and even the disclaimer on the bucket. They watched the aerial footage in stunned silence. When it ended, one of them simply muttered, "Damn. That's actually impressive." They agreed no crime had occurred, just an aerial composting event, within the limits of private aircraft use. They left with my lawyer's card in case Karen tried to escalate. And escalate she did. The next morning, HOA inboxes were flooded with angry emails from members demanding Karen's resignation. The senator's office issued a vague statement about unforeseen circumstances and postponed future involvement with local HOA groups. Karen tried to hold a press conference on her driveway, but a dozen teenagers showed up wearing cardboard clipboards and chanting, "The sky remembers." By the end of the week, the HOA board voted her out in an emergency meeting. She screamed the whole time, threatening lawsuits, recounts, and swearing that I was a danger to the skies. But her voice was drowned out by the latest remix of the Manure drop video, now synced to the chorus of Ride of the Valkyries. The funny thing is, I never meant to become a legend. I just wanted my helicopter back. But when you're pushed to the edge, when someone tries to ground not just your aircraft but your entire freedom to exist as you are, sometimes you've got to remind them, some people fly higher not because they have to, but because they can. You said. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, the entire neighborhood had split into two camps. On one side were the Karen loyalists, mostly the same people who complained about kids chalking on sidewalks or who measured grass height with rulers. On the other were the newly formed Free Fly Zone crowd, neighbors who'd always kept quiet but now wore grins and gave me thumbs up when I passed by. Even some of the fence-sitters had been won over by the sheer audacity of the manure drop. Turns out nothing unites a divided community like the sight of arrogance getting knocked down by a bucket of cow waste. Of course, Karen wasn't going to go down without throwing everything she had. By midweek, she'd retained a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against me for public endangerment, emotional distress, and assault with agricultural material. The phrase alone made my cousin Jason laugh so hard he choked on his coffee. He read through the paperwork and declared it the legal equivalent of a toddler throwing a tantrum in a business suit. Nothing she filed would hold up, not with the FAA logs, the video evidence, and the dozens of witnesses confirming no one was injured and no property was damaged, besides a soggy cardboard cutout of herself, which technically I owned. But Karen's mistake wasn't just legal. It was cultural. She hadn't grasped how fast things could move once a story took flight, pun fully intended. Within days, the video had racked up 500,000 views. Local news stations picked it up, treating it like the suburban version of Watergate. Headlines ranged from Pilot Plant's protest on HOA president to Operation Fertile Justice shakes quiet community. One late-night show host called me Captain Compost. A parody Twitter account was created under the name Helicopter Hero that posted fake HOA rules like, "Thou shalt not hover more than Karen's ego." Meanwhile, my actual life was shockingly calm. The FAA checked in, asked a few standard questions, and then closed their inquiry. Their final note read, "Operator maintained full compliance with FAA guidelines. No further action required." The sheriff's office followed suit. And just like that, Karen's complaints began to look less like civic concern and more like a personal vendetta spiraling into self-destruction. Still, there was one thing left unresolved. The HOA itself. Karen may have been ousted, but the board was still functioning and bruised. There was talk of a new president, re-elections, and possible changes to the bylaws. Some members even floated the idea of dissolving the HOA altogether, which caused a minor panic among those who believed their property values would evaporate the moment someone painted their door lime green. Then I got a surprising call from Derek, the quiet neighbor who first tipped me off about the senator. He invited me to a backyard gathering of concerned residents, which sounded suspicious at first, but I was curious. When I arrived, I found about 20 people sitting around a few fire pits, eating chips and laughing like old friends. These were the reasonable ones. The ones who'd had enough of Karen's dictatorship but never knew how to push back. They asked me what really happened. I told them everything: the towing, the invoice, the fake safety concerns. I showed them the FAA correspondence and my filed flight plan. By the end of it, someone passed me a beer and another neighbor, Marcia, said, "You know, we need someone like you on the board." I nearly choked. "Me? You want me to be HOA president?" Derek smirked. "Why not? At least we'd know the meetings would be short. You could just buzz low and everyone would scatter." At first, I dismissed the idea. I didn't want to be in charge of lawn length or Christmas light brightness. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe this was how real change happened. Not by dropping manure from the sky, though it helps, but by stepping in when the clipboard tyrants finally lose their grip. If someone like Karen could run the show for 6 years with nothing but spite and passive aggression, surely I could handle a few months of adulting without going mad. But before I could even decide, Karen gave me one final gift: her full, public meltdown. It happened during what was supposed to be a farewell HOA town hall to formally introduce her replacement. She stood in front of the clubhouse, red-faced and trembling, clutching a microphone with both hands. Cameras were rolling. Reporters were present. She looked directly into the lens and said, "This community has been hijacked by a man with a flying toilet bowl. And you all just cheered for him." Gasp. Chuckles. Someone coughed loudly into their hand to cover a laugh. Karen wasn't finished. "He humiliated me. He defecated from the air. And now you want him in charge? What's next? Jetpacks? Flamethrowers?" The speech was so unhinged that the newly elected board president, a retired teacher named Linda, had to walk over and gently take the microphone from her. Karen stormed off mid-meeting, muttering something about moving to a gated community where people knew the value of rules. A few people clapped. One guy even yelled, "Can we get a flyover to commemorate her departure?" After that, the transition was surprisingly smooth. Linda asked me to be a consultant for airspace and security matters. I agreed on one condition: no more citations for silly things like hummingbird feeders or overgrown sunflowers. She smiled and said, "Deal." Then, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A slim envelope with the FAA's official seal on it. I opened it cautiously, half expecting a retroactive fine or notice. Instead, it was a letter from an FAA regional director. It read, "We've reviewed the footage from the incident on March 16th. While not a sanctioned FAA operation, it was the most creative use of composting we've ever witnessed. Please find enclosed a commemorative certificate acknowledging your commitment to aerial environmental outreach. P.S. We laughed." Inside the envelope was a novelty certificate titled Pilot of the Year for services rendered in fertilizer and freedom. I hung it in the garage, just above the workbench where I kept the modified manure rig. I never did run for HOA president. I didn't have to. Karen's fall had reset everything. Rules were rewritten. People actually smiled at each other again. Kids started riding bikes down the street without being chased down for helmet violations. A few of the older residents even asked me for helicopter tours, claiming they wanted to see the community from above, the way only the gods and pilots do. And every so often, when I take off on a crisp Saturday morning, I fly a slow loop around the park. Not too low. Just enough that everyone can look up and remember that once, when petty tyranny tried to rise, it got hit with something a whole lot heavier than words. A few weeks after the whole manure from above incident, life settled into a strange, almost comical version of normal. For the first time in years, the HOA meetings weren't exercises in passive-aggressive tyranny. People actually talked about real neighborhood improvements instead of fighting over whether bird baths needed approval. Kids played in the street again. Derek built a treehouse and no one protested. I even saw a guy repaint his shutters in a shade of blue that Karen once deemed emotionally jarring, and no one burst into tears or handed out fines. It was like we'd all come out of a fog and realized we didn't actually have to live under a clipboard dictatorship. Karen, for what it was worth, had officially moved out. Her house went on the market just 10 days after her farewell freakout. A local real estate agent confided in me that she left the place in perfect condition, except for a note taped to the oven that said, "This neighborhood deserves me." Nobody cried. The only goodbye she got was from a teen down the street who held up a cardboard helicopter as she drove off. He dropped a handful of leaves from the roof for dramatic effect. The symbolism was poetic. I thought that would be the end of it. Really, I did. I figured the saga had reached its natural conclusion. Karen gone, peace restored, and a good story to tell at barbecues. But fate, as always, had one more twist tucked under its wing. It came in the form of an invitation. I found it in my mailbox, printed on high-quality cardstock, gold-embossed lettering, sealed in a stiff envelope that practically radiated importance. You are cordially invited to the annual Suburban Safety and Regulation Conference. I raised an eyebrow. Inside, a formal note stated I had been nominated to speak on community balance and innovative conflict resolution methods. There was no mention of helicopters, manure, or HOA drama. But at the bottom, in very small print, was a line that read, "Keynote curated by Senator Blevin's office." First, I laughed. Then I reread it. Then I called Jason. "You think this is a trap?" I asked. He paused, then said, "If it is, it's the most polite one I've ever seen. Go. Worst case scenario, you end up in a room full of Karens. Best case, you get to tell your story and eat catered snacks." So I went. The event was hosted at a downtown convention center with more polyester suits than a used car lot. Attendees included HOA presidents, zoning board members, city planners, and at least 4 guys who took the phrase community enforcement way too seriously. But among them were a few like-minded people. Folks who understood that neighborhoods weren't military zones, and that compromise didn't mean surrender. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped onto the stage in front of a crowd that had no idea what was coming. I started with the basics, my background, my role as a pilot, my property setup. I walked them through the timeline, the overreach, the illegal tow. I explained the legal steps I took, the paperwork I filed, and how I exhausted every reasonable route first. Then, without warning, I clicked to the next slide, which was a still frame from the manure drop, mid-fall, just as the payload met cardboard Karen. The room erupted. Some gasped. Some laughed. A few covered their mouths in horror. One man shouted, "That's heresy!" But before anyone could derail it, I brought them back. I talked about why I did it. About frustration. About standing up when systems fail. About satire and symbolism, and when ridiculousness is the only language people like Karen understand. And I ended with this. I never set out to be the neighborhood menace. I just wanted to land my helicopter in peace. But when someone builds a throne out of rules and starts swinging it like a sword, sometimes the only thing to do is remind them that authority without humility is just noise. Very loud, very annoying noise. By the time I left the stage, something had shifted. People weren't just laughing, they were nodding. They were taking note. I wasn't encouraging chaos. I was reminding them that rules are meant to protect, not control. That day, I received a standing ovation and 3 separate offers to consult on community engagement initiatives. Jason told me later, "You accidentally started a movement." I told him, "It smells like one." Back home, word of the speech spread faster than I thought it would. The video hit social media, chopped and captioned with dramatic music. One version had a choir playing behind the manure drop. Another was remixed with quotes from historical leaders, which felt a little over the top but hilarious nonetheless. People started referring to it as the Fertilizer Rebellion. My mailbox filled with letters, Some from pilots, others from homeowners thanking me for standing up to their own local tyrant. A guy in Arizona sent me a photo of himself holding a "Compost the Control Freaks" sign in front of his HOA clubhouse. But the best surprise came from the FAA. A month after the event, I received a certified package. Inside was a plaque. At first, I thought it was a warning or a fine, but it was something else entirely. In recognition of innovative conflict resolution from the skies, the Federal Aviation Administration awards this honorary commendation to my name, pilot, neighbor, and unintentional hero. They had signed it with a handwritten note: "Next time, try glitter. Easier on the sensors." I hung the plaque in the living room next to a framed still of the cardboard Karen mid-collapse. People who visited would always double-take and ask, "Is that real?" And every time I would nod and say, "Oh, it's very real." The irony is, I hadn't flown the manure bucket since that day. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. That single moment said more than 1,000 HOA complaints ever could. It was a reminder, to them and to me, that sometimes the best way to defend your peace isn't with confrontation, but with creativity. And a little well-placed fertilizer. The helicopter still sits in the backyard, now fully accepted by the neighborhood as a kind of community mascot. Kids wave every time it takes off. One neighbor even painted a helipad mural on his shed roof that says, "Land here if Karen returns." I can't promise I'll never be provoked again. There's always another clipboard warrior waiting in the wings. But next time, they'll know one thing before they come swinging with their citations and fake authority. I've got altitude. And a bucket on standby.